God puts us in nations, in places, not by mistake, but to do a job. What if we opened our eyes to the needs of our colleagues, of our leaders, of our subordinates, and we were a priest on their behalf? Welcome to the Repurposing Business Podcast. My name is Brett Johnson.
And I'm Len Johnson.
And we're going to be talking about how to get our business into God's business. Our subtext is Let My Business Go, and we'll have guests from around the world. So thank you for joining us this week and every week on the Repurposing Business Podcast. Well, welcome to the Repurposing Business Podcast. My name is Brett Johnson, and we're in the series on When Capital Meets Eternity. I'm delighted today to have Kortsch here. And when I first met Uli, I think you were a Canadian. Are you still a Canadian, Uli? Is that your background?
I'm totally confused. German, Canadian, I have dual citizenship right now. I dropped my German citizenship, so I only have two, only Canadian and American.
Fantastic. That's great. And not only were you confused about your country, but when I met you, you were a business guy dressed up as a missionary. I think we first met in 1987 out in Hawaii at a youth with mission, a YWAM leadership thing. And I thought, this is an interesting guy. He's in missions, but he owns apartment buildings and he's working in business, and he gets the business missions connection, which for a lot of people, these were two different worlds. And so we had a connection back there, which was great. But Uli, you've gone on to do a variety of different things. You're executive director of the Monetary Trust Initiative, and you're also president of some other businesses. And you've gone on to write a number of books dealing with the macroeconomic, big banking system side of things. So I'm delighted to have you with us. Tell us a bit about your journey. How did you end up dealing with this space, and what got you to being so interested in this?
It's interesting, actually. When I put my first book out, the publisher came and said, "So walk me through this." Exactly, your question, Brett. Like, how did you ever get here? And which I hadn't really analyzed, but I thought, okay, I guess I have to think about this if they want me to write something about it. And what it comes down to, so I've worked in 60 plus countries, and saw after a while that in the developing world, people can work literally 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they still have trouble putting bread on the table. Yeah. And they're not dumb, they're not lazy. So there's a fundamental problem that goes beyond the things that we normally look at as far as investments and some other. It's got to be a structural issue. And this started bothering me for about 5 years, starting in the late 80s. And I started complaining, complaining about this. And people say, well, Kortsch, what's the answer? Well, I don't know what the answer is, but I know that there's something fundamentally wrong. And this guy's really crazy. In Christmas, I ran the conference in 2013. In Christmas 2012, we were living out east at the time, and we rented a large place in the mountains here. As a matter of fact, you see the picture here in the mountains in Colorado, and had the whole family come. And I think you need to be in that kind of a space so you're relaxed and everybody's playing in the snow and all that kind of stuff. And I still remember we had this big rough-hewn table, and I had this instant download. Okay, I've been thinking about this for 5 years, but I had no straight answer. And I had this download as to how to create a completely different monetary and banking system. Yeah. And so that was correct. And that all of January, I just thought about this. I started making notes, and I ended up with about 4 pages of point form notes. Oh my goodness, it would solve this problem. This would solve this problem. This would solve this problem. I never talked to anybody about it. This would solve this problem. And then at the end of January, I thought, talk about hubris. Here you are trying to reinvent the world's monetary system. This is really insane what you're doing. This is really crazy. And so in February, I started calling around. I said, I got to talk to a monetary economist and work through some of this stuff to how crazy am I? So I found somebody who had been involved in the major monetary and debt turnover in Argentina in the late 80s, which I had been very obliquely involved in, and called him. And I was living outside of Philadelphia at the time. And he said, "Look, I'm going to be in Philadelphia in a couple of weeks." I said, "Oh, great. Come to my house. I'm living in the suburbs. And let's meet. I'm going to need about an hour and a half." And so I printed up my 4 pages, copy for him, copy for me. I went through my 4 pages of notes. I'll never forget what he said at the end of the hour and a half. He said, "Uli, I really like you. You're a really neat guy, but you're totally out of your mind. Totally out of your mind, man." And I thought, okay, I thought this was really good. And I thought, okay, all right, I'm really out of my mind. 2 days later, he calls me. And he says, "I can think of nothing but what we went through. This is unbelievable. This would really, really work." I thought, okay, now this is interesting. So then I happened to be on an American think tank, and the chairman was a runner-up to become president of the Federal Reserve Bank, and one of the banks. And so I called him. I had his private cell number. And I said, "Hey, it was William Dunkelberg, the friends of his, we call him Dunk." And I said, "Dunk, I need about an hour and a half of your time. I got to do something with you." He says, "Okay." So I don't have any time. Days are crazy. Look, really early in the morning. I said, "Okay, I hate really early in the morning. That's my private time. That's I value my." Anyway, I said, "Fine, whatever you say." So same thing. I brought my 4 pages of notes. I got about 15 minutes into it. He said, Stop. I know exactly where you're going. This is Fisherian economics. I'm the chairman of the bank." He says, "Uli, we've got to do this. What do you want me to do?" And I thought, okay. And that's what really got me onto the path of where I am. Then he's the one, he was chairman of the Global Interdependence Center, got me to run a conference at the Federal Reserve Bank, which initially I thought actually he was running.
Yeah.
He said, no, you do it. So sort of several weeks into the planning, I said, "Well, no, Uli, no, you're doing this." And I thought, good Lord. So I created a link with the IMF, and you got a bunch of hotshot people together, and it's grown from there. That ended up being my first book. Then I was asked to run a conference in Switzerland, to change the constitution of the country there, and then Athens under the auspices of the governor of the Bank of Greece, and been going ever since. Trying to get deeper into the weeds, into sort of modernizing something that was thought through initially in the 30s to get the US out of the Great Depression. Right. And basically every economist in the United States signed off on this. This is what you have to do. And then the big banks killed it. I have the act of Congress that had been put forward, et cetera. But that's a long-term story of how the world ever got into this.
That sounds like the same stuff that old Michael Unten Guggenberger picked up on in Austria in the 1930 or so, when they started creating their own currency in one of the cantons. Is that right? It was in Austria. It's Austria.
Yes, both the wir and the wir, which in German means us, and there's been a number of those, and Switzerland is still running. They tend to be minor, and usually, sad to say, the central bank, once it gets, the moment it gets to be popular, they shut it down.
They shut it, yeah.
That's sort of the. I'm trying to think of the Vias of Switzerland, and German was the Austrian was the. It's terrible. The other major example is in the two islands. Mind you, they have a population of 63.5, and so that's why they don't count very much. That England took over from France during the Battle of Waterloo and the Napoleon, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. They were dying on the vine, so they created their own currency. Very similar kind of a structure. So
yeah. Interesting. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I've seen people, and this is a bit of a sidetrack, but at the almost at the charitable end. How do you deal with problems? I met a guy in Portland who was worried about the homeless issue. And, you give a homeless person money, what do they spend it on? And so on. So they created their own coin. And then the local merchants agreed to it that this could be exchanged for certain things, for food, for clothing, for dry cleaning or whatever, laundry, but not for cigarettes and alcohol and so on. And so you've seen some of those, the local exchange trading systems, but something needs to be done at the bigger level. And so I'm fascinated to hear about your journey. And I love the way how you've got a problem, you've got something that's bothering you, and you've kind of got it ruminating in your mind, and then out pops an answer. And so it's great. So let's unpack. Uli, I think most people think typical scenario, roll back the clock. This is the way the banking world works. There's a Middletown, USA. It's almost like the 1946 movie, It's a Wonderful Life. There's George Bailey. Yeah, you got 10,000 people in the town. They put money in the bank. You got other people who, 1,000 or 100 business people who borrow money out of the bank, and hopefully he makes more of his interest than he's paying, and he lends out of what's been put into the bank. I mean, it's real money that went in, and he lends it out, and there we go. There we go. And that's the way the banking system works. But that's not quite the case, right?
No. Let me give you. May I give you the standard example that I use? And those of you who've read my book or have seen it, pardon me, I hope I don't bore you. So here's a standard example I use. So I go to the bank. I want to buy let's keep it in the U.S. because it makes it easier from an internal. I'm going to buy a Ford, an American car, okay? And I need to borrow $30,000. So I go to the bank, and they say, okay, Mr. Kortsch, yeah, you got good credit rating, all that kind of stuff. Cool, we'll lend you the $30,000. So then I go to the Ford dealer, and I give the Ford dealer the $30,000 plus, of course, some extra. Let's not worry about the extra. And there's always there. Obviously, they're not going to lend me 100% of the value, okay? And then the Ford dealer goes to Ford and gives Ford the $30,000 in order to buy the car on his lot. And the Ford manufacturing company gives a $30,000 to the worker who works to build the Ford. And that worker, God bless him, happens to have his accounts at my bank, and he deposits the $30,000, and that's the $30,000 I borrowed. Did you logically walk through what I just said? That's one big circle. The 30,000 never came from anywhere.
Yeah.
And that is exactly how it does not work.
Yeah.
That, as Brett, as you know, that is not, but that's what everybody thinks.
Yeah.
They say, banks intermediate. No, they don't. Banks do not intermediate. Richard Werner has done some extensive studies on this. I don't know if you've read any of his material. He's a good man, really, really good man, very, very sharp. Should we go to what actually happens, or just stop at this?
Yeah, let's talk about what actually happens, because, okay, say you got your bank in Middletown. Firstly, when they lend money, do they actually have that money? And do debits and credits, if you like, I'm an accountant by background, and we know the debits are near the window, the credits are near the door, but they got to equal each other, roughly. And there's supposed to be this double entry. So you think that if I borrow money, the bank actually has the money, and so on. And yet, in the real world system, there's this whole underlying thing of debt. Tell us how that works, and how money gets produced.
Let's go back to my car. So I'm back to the same bank, and the bank agrees, says, okay, Kortsch, we'll lend you the $30,000. When I sign that contract, that is an asset to the bank. Yeah. The bank now has a $30,000 asset, and it's out of balance. This is a very simple picture, okay? But in the greater system, this is what happens. And so what the bank does, the $63 word we use is ex nihilo, out of nothing, creates a deposit in my account that is equal to my contract, to the $30,000. I now have $30,000 of what we call bank money or electronic money, okay? And that is a $30,000. Then I go all the way around the circle, whatever. And I really don't care where the worker banks, because it's immaterial. But it's the bank that creates the money. This is one reason why we have to have debt. If all of the debts were paid off, then US dollars would cease to exist. Yeah. That's a very, very simple statement. But the Federal Reserve does not create the money on the street. That gets a little more complicated. Creates reserves. Let's not go there for the time being. People think that the Federal Reserve creates our money, which then somehow magically ends up in banks, which magically end up in my account.
Yeah.
Let me say one more thing that most people don't understand, because virtually nobody ever reads the contract. When you open an account at a bank, you get a contract. And you know, I've had all sorts of meetings, and I've said, okay, put up your hand. I know you all have bank accounts. Have any of you ever read your bank contract? I've never seen a single hand go up. Because the moment let's say you deposit $100 into, quote, your account, that is not your money anymore. You now become a general obligor to that bank, but it ceases to be your money. And people really don't understand that.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. So banks can, they take something, a piece of paper, that becomes an asset because they've made a loan, and they can, you hinted at the reserve things. There have been laws which said, okay, you have to have a certain ratio of actual assets to these loans that you're putting out there. And historically, those reserves tended to be quite high. In fact, even if we go back at the central banking level, up until the time of Nixon, a central bank had to back up the money that they were putting out, their money supply, with gold, right?
Only internationally. The in-country gold standard system died in '33. The international system died under Nixon. Yeah. Can I go back just for a minute, because a lot of people who are listening might not understand how banking accounting works. You, Brett, as an accountant, obviously do. What to me is a debt, to the bank is an asset. It's the very reverse, and people have trouble getting their heads around that. So my loan contract, which is a debt to me, is an asset to the bank. You got to understand that. Yeah. Because that's how the money creation system works. If you got that backwards, then everything that we're talking about right now, that doesn't make any sense. Sorry, I interrupted.
And so then, I mean, just to pick up on that, so when the crash was going on in 2008, George Bush was president, and he said to people, the answer is go out and spend. Right. We've got a problem. And the average person's thinking, hold on, if I'm running out of money, I should spend less. I should stick more under the mattress. And Bush is saying, go out, spend like there's no tomorrow.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And it's this, because your spending you're going to have to borrow the money to do it. It's going to create assets in the bank, and then that will help keep things going under the system.
Can I talk about inflation and interest rates and growth just for a minute? Because what you said is really, really important, and I want to go back to that. So the way our current system works normally, and we have been abnormal for at least 10 years. Okay, so I want to go back to the pre-QE days when we controlled our economy through interest rates. We still do that to a certain extent, but much less so, especially when the interest rates are essentially zero. But now I want to go back to what you said, because it's really, really important. Inflation means that it takes more money to pay for an asset. Correct? That's what inflation is. Right. Deflation is the opposite. Let's keep deflation out of this for the time being. Okay, gets a little more complicated. So what is the price of money? The price of money is the interest. Okay, and so when we have inflation, then you would think that the interest rates should drop, but they don't, because the central bank artificially increases the interest rates. Why? In order to make borrowing more expensive. Okay, because that decreases the amount of money that we create through debt. Yeah, that's why that sort of works, and it's counterintuitive. From the point of view of what you buy with what. So if you think, so back to what I said, inflation means you pay more money for an asset. Okay, so therefore you would think interest rates should drop. No, they don't. They go up, because the central bank says, I don't want you to borrow so much. because I don't want you to create so much money because we're going to slow this whole thing down. Sorry,
yeah, no, that's interesting. It's interesting. So we've got a few tracks going over here. We've got our asset-backed track. Once upon a time, there was this notion that, if there was a problem, you could go and pull your money out of the bank. And part of what you're saying is, A, it's not your money anymore. Secondly, it's not there. I mean, actually, if every customer showed up at Bank of America, Wells Fargo, wherever, showed up and said, okay, I want my money back, they would say, A, it's not your money. B, we don't have it. Yeah.
Okay, you say everybody. Can I lower that to 10 or 15%? People showed up. All the banks are illiquid.
Yeah.
And a lot of people. So we in the 1930s, the Great Depression, we created the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is pretty well global. That the FDIC is what it's called in the U.S. I don't know how many. Do we have all American listeners or how?
No, we'll have international. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So it's pretty well the same around the world. So during the Great Recession, not Depression of the 30s, the recession, 2007, 8, 9, 2009, we increased it from 100,000 to 250,000. So if you, the government, my taxes, guarantee your deposit up to $250,000. How much money is actually in the FDIC? The Act of Congress says the FDIC must have 1.15%.
Yeah.
You get a handle on that? And by the way, in 2008, they went below that. They didn't even have 1.15%.
Yeah.
So the next 5 years, they try to catch up. By the way, the way they catch up, they charge the banks fees for that. But the bottom line is, it's your and my tax-paying capacity that is the real guarantee of what's going on here.
Yeah. Very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, so here we are. We talked a little bit about the notion of reserves is a bit fictional, and then money is created out of thin air. Well, out of these, what for us is a debt is a problem. For them, it's an asset. So they want to encourage the lending because then they can ramp up. So if you borrow $30,000 for your Ford, can the bank create an equivalent 30,000, or can they leverage that up to more in terms of what they can, their capacity?
There are multiple ratios. The reserve ratios today are absolutely meaningless. We have a surfeit of reserves. Yeah. Reserves are only, as a matter of fact, some countries don't even have reserve. There are no reserve ratios. They don't care. They're meaningless. In the developing world, reserves are still used, and the economy can be sped up or slowed down by arbitrarily changing reserve ratios. But that's a very brutal way of doing it, because you can change that by 1 or 2%, and it has huge implications on weak banks. Strong banks, they'll manage. Reserve ratios in the US officially are 10%. That is absolute malarkey, because they have a whole series of different types of assets, at the result of which, in the total banking system, if you take assets versus mandatory reserves, it's probably less than 1%. 100 to 1 leveraging. Okay. Yeah. I had an argument several years ago with the director of research for the IMF, who's become a good friend of mine. And I told him, I thought it was around 3%. He says, Uli, you're way out of whack. And I go, holy cow, I really thought I knew what I was talking about. He says, not anywhere close to 3%. I go, really? Oh my goodness. He says, oh no, not anywhere close to it. By the way, for those listeners who don't know what reserves are two things. They're cash in the vault of a bank, and there are deposits at the central bank, which in the US is the Federal Reserve Bank. And only banks have deposits at the Federal Reserve Bank. Those are reserves. Just to confuse you even further, we really have two different kinds of money. Well, some people will include even more, but at least two different kinds of money in the US. There's kind of money on the street. Cash, by the way, is basically zero. It almost doesn't exist. The only place where there's a lot of American cash is international, in brothels and and drug deals and arms deals. That's where the what we call bennies, Benjamin Franklin, because there's pictures on the $100 bills. That's where the bennies are. And the cash is not in the United States. The cash is external. So cash within the United States is meaningless.
I know we're going through the roadblocks in Zimbabwe. They have dollar bills that are so thick because they're so dirty. They've been used so many times. But that's what you need to get through a roadblock in Zimbabwe.
Oh, I know. I've been there, man. I take a stack every time I go. You better believe it. And the $100 bills, you better get the new ones with the.
You got to get the new. You got to get the new.
They will not take the old. Oh yeah, I've gone through all that. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so fantastic. So there's very little cash over here, and you were talking about the different types of money.
So one kind of money are the reserves. Reserves are only used between banks. So most of you probably don't know. At one point we actually had $100,000 bills. Did you get that? You ever seen one of those? I don't have one either. I do have some other kind of money here that is still in circulation. That gets technical. We had $100,000 bills, and those were reserve. That was reserve money. It was never used on the street. It was bank to bank as a clearing. So today we clear everything electronically, but we use reserves to clear that. You will never get any reserves as a person or as a business. You'll never will. Okay. What you get is almost exclusively electronic or banking money. And here's a crazy fact. That's what you pay your taxes with, right? The IRS, you issue them a check or you wire money out of your account, right? Did you know that that's not legal tender? Did you know that? It's not. It is not legal tender. But try to go to the IRS and pay with cash, which is legal tender.
Yeah.
And they're going to throw you out the door. Anyway.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Weird system.
Weird system. Yeah. So, really, right now, so 2008 didn't solve the underlying issues in the system. No. The government bailed out the banks. The banks kept on doing what they were doing. And seems like they've been on a run again at giving away money for nearly free. You know, the housing markets are going up. The stock market is going up. And a lot of that going up is based on money that's produced out of thin air, not out of underlying real concrete assets and activity.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. And so what's your gut feeling? I mean, clearly when stuff is out of line with the way that God designed it to work, then it sets itself up for failure. Yeah, and so in your thinking, you've been thinking about, well, from either a logical or a theological or a biblical or a sort of eternal principle.
All of those combined.
All of the above, yeah. You know, what makes sense to you as a system? How do you think it should work? And then I have a parallel question on, you know, are things getting more centralized and or more democratized? So on the more centralized stuff, the historical story is whenever there's a crisis, be it a Second World War or a First World War, whatever, you know, countries fight with each other, but the winners are determined not so much on the battlefield, but what happens 5-10 years afterwards economically. So you could say Germany was a big winner out of the Second World War. You know, Switzerland, the US, you know, it's not a case of how many soldiers died, but what happened to the changes in the economic systems. So perhaps you can just delve into the international systems a little bit. I know you understand things like not just the central banks, but the Bank of International Settlements and so forth, and what happens between countries and what's their vested interest at that level.
Oh, man. Let me go back to your beginning statements just now, and I want to differentiate between a currency that is backed and a currency that is based. let me make a bold statement. I don't think there's ever been a currency ever in history in the last 5,000 years, however long we've been around, that has been 100% backed. By the definition of the word backed, what I'm trying to say is, let's move it into modern times and let's talk about a gold-backed currency. Okay, the theory of a gold-backed currency was that I could take my money to the bank, and at $32.50, $32.50, whatever, I can get my ounce of gold. Okay, that is a full backing. Okay, let's go back to Roman times. So the reason we stamped coins, the stamped coin was always worth more than the actual metal content, because the moment it wasn't, everybody would melt it down. We've had those times. We have old dimes right now, by the way. If you the silver content of pre-1966, I think, dimes are worth a lot more than 10 cents. Okay, so I've been to a gold depository. I was told I was one of only 5 human beings ever allowed in who were not direct employees, and they got bags and bags and bags of old dimes. Aside from gold bars, I have a picture of me backed by, every bar is $1.3 million. Anyway, crazy pictures. I said to Carol, I'm going to put my Facebook page. She goes, "Oh no, you won't." So the value of a currency has always been greater than, quote, the backing. So let's go back to pre-1933 here in the US. We had a gold-backed dollar. At that point, as far as I know historically, there was never more than 40% in actual gold content versus, and they try to keep it at that. So the backing, if you think about it, that means 40% of all the owners of U.S. currency could go to a bank and could get their gold. Okay, well, no, that's never going to happen, and it never did happen. Okay, the problems were international on a trade basis, and that's why Nixon took us off the international standard in gold, because we coming out of Bretton Woods in 1944, so just before the end of World War II. By that time, the Allies knew that they were going to win. And they had a global monetary conference in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, and said, okay, this is a system. This is how we're going to set it up. And the U.S. dollar will replace the gold standard, in return for which the U.S. absolutely categorically promises to exchange every U.S. dollar for gold internationally as desired by central banks and trading partners. Okay. So that was a hard standard, both internally and externally, but it was the global trading thing. That's what was absolutely locked in. Yeah. Okay, and then that's what Nixon broke, because it was people just didn't believe it anymore because of inflation and bad monetary policy on the U.S.'s part, and they said the only way to back out of this, we're going to bankrupt ourselves, saying the U.S. And so we've got to break the international gold standard that the U.S. had allowed. So back to what I was saying just now, the difference between a backing and a basing. A basing means you can't go to your bank and get whatever it's based on. Okay. However, there's a hard basis on which you create currency. That's what I'm in favor of. Okay. And what is that basis? And it's a combination of GDP and inflation. And those are hard things to measure. I recognize that, but that's why I'm saying, and I'm happy to get into the weeds on that if you wish. But the listener needs to understand the difference between a backing and a basing. That they're very similar concepts. The words sound similar, but they're actually quite different. Yeah. Let me go one step further, which is the IMF, the SDR, the special drawing rights. SDRs, and they're becoming more important again. And I want to talk about this, because the difference between the basing and the backing. Okay. The SDR is currently a basket of currencies in order to create global stability. But the person who was the chair at the IMF to create this, who I know quite well, he sends me papers and asks for my opinion, all that kind of stuff. So what I think, he realizes that if there were to be a global financial crash, which obviously he thinks there will be, I think there will be, and I think Brett thinks there will be, gathering by his comments, then what he wants to do is change the SDR and go back to an actual backing whereby it's a combination of gold, silver, wheat, major global trading entities. So you will not be able to go to your bank with your SDRs, because he's saying the US will never, he's trying to go to a world currency. He doesn't know that I really don't want that at all. I've never told him that. You're not going to go to the bank and get 100 bushels of wheat. So instead, what you get is AAA certificates based on the backing. That's where he's going. So I just want to put all those things in together. Hopefully I don't confuse listeners too much with, maybe it's too much information, but
it does mean that there are people who are basically saying that the current system is not sustainable. So what is there going to be as an alternative? And I know that there seem to be different camps on this. Some would like to go asset-backed. Some would like to go gold-backed, saying gold, silver is in the Bible, therefore it's a good thing. There was also wheat and some other things. I mean, perhaps the Egyptian economy ran more on wheat than it did on gold. And but commodities, tangible things backing up currencies. There are others who are going more virtual, I would imagine, with the cryptos and so forth, and saying the currency is trust and transparency and so forth, and which is a little bit hard to monetize. But they are, there are people who go in that direction. But at least there are people saying there's something wrong with the system.
Yes, more and more people are agreeing with that.
And so that creates, I think, an opportunity for believers to be thinking through, okay, one of the reasons we don't have great alternatives is because we don't ask God for answers. And you have this 5-year question rattling around in your head, and then all of a sudden there's an aha moment. And we need to get that out of the realm of crazy into the realm of Main Street, in terms of people of faith understanding historically how economics have worked, how it worked in Scripture, and how it might work today. Because, I mean, I've spoken, with not as many people as you have in terms of positions of authority and so on, but they're grasping for answers. They're looking for answers. And so you would like to go back to something that's actually tied in more to reality and less to what some would. We haven't talked much about fiat currencies, but basically the world of fake believe money.
That's right.
Great. Go ahead.
I mean, do you want to ask questions, or do you want to give you an overview? Well,
let me ask you a little bit about the democratization of capital a little bit. So because we've got these tensions. On the one hand, we have a lot more people, and this in some respects follows, just as the New Testament church grew through economic hubs, we've seen countries grow post-revival, countries like Chile and other countries where a middle class grew out of a revival. And we have that true in even some countries we wouldn't have thought of, like the UK and Switzerland and Austria. Now we look at them as well-developed nations, but they followed a biblical reformation. And so we have to, there is, in some sense, a greater democratization in that more people have capital. But then on the other side, there's a view that said, well, there are still some people who would rather control the capital and keep it in the hands of fewer people. And that creates a challenge. What's your view on that? Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, back to Fisher here in the U.S. in the Act of Congress that he and the people that he worked with, authored and try to pass, it was killed by the big banks. I mean, you have centers of power that gain unbelievable benefit through the current system, through both. I mean, let's. I don't know. When you talk about wealth equality, when you talk about business cycles, when you talk about stability of currency, when you talk about inflation, all of those things are direct effects of the system that we have. So it's not like there are really evil people at the Federal Reserve that are doing this. They are living within a system that's given to them. They have a set of toolboxes, and they try to do the best with a toolbox that they have been given legally. So in order to create a change, we need acts of Congress here in the US. Ultimately, it's a legal issue. And it's the same international. For us to make some of the changes that need to be made, these are legal changes. We're locked into a certain system of doing things. Even though, back to the US, the Fed has an enormous amount of leeway, and the worse things get, the more they're going to stretch that leeway. But it's all within the context of this system, and it's the wrong context. That's the problem. You have a system whereby those who have get more automatically. It's not like anybody is deliberately doing that. The system is geared towards that. The debt-based system. So basically, 100% of our money is debt-based. Was either debt-based at the Fed or most of it is debt-based in the banking system. Okay, and that very thought structure is totally wrong. And that's, back, if you want to read economic papers on this, go to Richard Werner. I mean, he's done the best studies that I know of anybody in this area. Neat guy, by the way, solid Christian, really, really neat guy. But most of the listeners probably aren't into the sort of academic side of things from a structure. There's another way of doing this whereby the money is not created through debt, but the money is created through our productive capacity. That's ultimately what God has given us. And that's why I'm not in favor of a gold-backed currency, for the simple reason, if we, like, all the gold in the world, by the way, is about a swimming pool, an Olympic swimming. That's all there is, the whole world. Okay. Yeah. And the reason it has value is because we think it has value.
Yeah.
Did you hear what I just said? Yeah. If you take the gold is used primarily for electronics and jewelry, and we think it has value. So it's held by central banks. Those are basically the three biggest uses of gold. Okay. If we did not think it had value, gold would probably lose 80% of its value.
Yeah.
So therefore, what is its real value? Okay, so we have in economics, we have this thing called Dutch disease. The Dutch disease is where one aspect of an economy becomes so powerful, it sort of overrides everything else. That can be oil. So suddenly you have a big oil find. Okay, that can be gold. I'm going to get there right away. So usually it's oil or a direct commodity produced. So suddenly you have a bumper crop in a developing world. For instance, I remember I was in Zambia. They had a huge bumper crop, and so I was talking to the IMF and the World Bank guys, the res reps there. So they're going to sanitize that and pull money out of the circulation because the currency was going to go through the roof. What happens with Dutch disease is this single commodity is so powerful, think of oil, suddenly big oil gusher, okay, that everybody wants it, everybody buys it, and they all buy your currency. Your currency goes through the roof, and it bankrupts all the businesses that have anything to do with any kind of external trade. Now, think of Spain. Okay, when Spain found the New World and hordes of gold, Spain went bankrupt. You're going, what? They got tons and tons of gold, and suddenly this one commodity, gold, which their currency was based on, they suddenly had so much of it that it drove everything else crazy. And this is the problem with having external factors that are not production based. By production means our brain, our ability to work, and our in-ground and above-ground assets, where we properly use what God has given us to create wealth, properly wealth. And a currency can be based on that. And that was Fisher's structure.
So that's that's an interesting one. So in my book, Transforming Society, I've got a thing called societal value chains, how you'll take a raw material and you'll turn it into a product and into markets and so forth. And ultimately, in other words, there's the ability to create wealth. There's a process involved in doing that. So are you suggesting that in some ways one could come up with a measure nation by nation? So Zambia's mechanism might look different from Nigeria's, might look different from the UK's, for example. But when you talk about GDP, you're looking at their whole wealth creation cycle, that has a value to it.
Correct.
And you in some way quantify that, and then that becomes the backing for a currency.
That's right. I in my book, I have a chapter in there as to how to do that. And I don't want to lock it in, and I try to say, look, here is an example of how this can be done. And I give this formula. A good friend of mine, I sent it to him. I said, so what do you think about this? And he said, I took one look at that and I just started speaking in tongues. Roared and laughed right out. Yes. The point is to think through exactly what Brett just said. There are ways of honestly analyzing this, and coming up with something close. What I'm suggesting is every quarter we readjust. Well, let's see how close we were, and to do this very publicly, and to keep on correcting. And there will be a learning process. Of course, there is, but it'll be a heck of a lot better. And give a lot more equality, and greatly decrease the amplitude of business cycles when this method is used.
What I like about that, Uli, is a couple of different things. One is at a societal transformation level, we have, if you come from the US, then you there with the money to help people solve their country's problems. And we've seen that people try that and that fail. But my belief is that God places the assets in every country that it needs to sustain itself and to trade and to. So
absolutely, totally agree. Yes,
that's one piece. I have a friend who's writing a book on the tribes of Israel. He believes that every tribe had a different asset, a different underlying precious metal, stone, something like that. So tied into their destiny, tied into their identity, which kind of supports what you're talking about. So you could, if you tie into God's view of every tongue, tribe, and nation, God getting glory, getting value out of that, then God in his justice would have placed within every nation the assets that are needed. The question is, we need a fair measurement system so that somebody doesn't arbitrarily say, this country's assets are better than that country's if you relate it to actual work and productivity. Is that what I hear you saying?
I really agree. And a lot of the assets are human. Education, thinking, analyzing. So we've got commodity assets. Then we've got physical assets as to size, rivers, ocean, etc. But the biggest asset, more and more in our world today, these are human beings. Right. It's our capacity to create wonderful things out of almost nothing. Hey, I mean, look at, we just, this morning, or was it yesterday morning, we flew a helicopter on Mars. Really? That's unbelievable. That's human ingenuity. It's and ultimately it's difficult to measure, but in the long run, you will see that.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, that's very, very interesting. So that's really your hope for the future, is that we begin, in some respect, it's placing a value on people created in the image of God who work, and work is a good thing, and then and then that work gets represented fairly in terms of national assets, and the intercountry trading and so forth is done on a fair basis, rather than Man's solution is we'll create either a one world currency, or we'll create this, or we'll just perpetuate the system where the haves get more, the few people get more, the top, small percentage get more, and the rest are kind of stymied.
Yeah. I think we're drawing to a close here. In the front of my book, I have a quote by Wilberforce, who spent 50 years, his whole life, getting rid of slavery, first in England and then globally in the whole British Commonwealth. British Empire at that time, wasn't a Commonwealth. And I have a quote from him that says, roughly, I don't have it in front of me, "Now that I have told you, you can never again say you did not know."
Wow.
And that's the whole thrust of my book. It's against slavery, because we live in a slavery-inducing system. And what I'm trying to say with the book is, now that I have told you, you can never again say you did not know.
Yeah. So for people listening to this podcast, go and check out Uli Kortsch, which is Ulikortsch. That's a whole lot of consonants over there. Uli Kortsch.
Typical German.
Yeah, excellent. And I'll put that in the notes and send that out. And I would really, really encourage people to read it and take a look at it. And Uli's done the kindness of saying, okay, here's how you read my book. You read chapter 1, you read the last chapter, and then you go back and dip into the in-between chapters as you need to shore up your thinking. So he's made it quite simple for us. It's fascinating. It's a good read. And Uli, I appreciate your thinking. I appreciate your work on this. And perhaps later in the series, we'll have a chance to reconnect and talk about, okay, now that we've looked at all the parts and the problems and the moving pieces, how then shall we bank? How then shall we finance? How then shall we live with this world of capital? Because our goal is to say, okay, capital isn't just something, it's not just financial capital, as you say, it's broader, it's spiritual capital, human capital, relational capital. And how do we make the connection between the importance of capital and eternity? And in some of the research we spoke about earlier, looking at other faiths and what they've done, they've made a better connection between capital and eternity than we have. And so I'd love to explore that with you if you're open on a future conversation, and certainly would love to get your links and your information out to folks who are listening to this podcast. So Uli, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate your time and your perspectives.
Thank you, Brett. It's been a joy. I appreciate very much what you're doing. Thanks.
Good. Thank you.